Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. I'm Ocean Robbins, and our next interview is with Dr. David Perlmutter. David Perlmutter, MD, is a board-certified neurologist and a 6-time New York Times best-selling author. His books have been translated into 32 languages. His most recent bestseller is Drop Acid: The Surprising New Science of Uric Acid, The Key to Losing Weight, Controlling Blood Sugar, and Achieving Extraordinary Health. And Dr. Perlmutter serves on the board of directors and is a fellow for the American College of Nutrition. He serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, and he has published extensively in peer-reviewed scientific journals, including Archives of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and the Journal of Applied Nutrition. In this interview, we're going to be talking with Dr. Perlmutter about Alzheimer's prevention, about the power of diet and lifestyle for mental and cognitive health, and about the influence of your microbiome on your brain and your well-being. David, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, Ocean, I always look forward to spending time with you, and I'm very grateful that we had the opportunity to meet in person recently in Mexico, so great to see you again.
Well, me too, David, and great to see you too. I want to start off by talking a little bit about the big picture of Alzheimer's and dementia and their impact on our species. Can you lay out what's at stake here for us?
It's a much, much bigger situation, problem, certainly, than I think we are willing to admit. Yes, we have 6.5 million individuals in America who've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is by and large a fatal condition. That number is around 50 to 55 million globally, with 10 million new patients annually. 1 in 3 individuals age 65 or over is already suffering from some form of cognitive decline. So we've got to do everything we can to prevent this problem on the front end. You know, Desmond Tutu had a quote that I find has a lot of traction for me. He said, yes, it's important to take people out of the river, but it's really important to find out why they're falling in the first place. And I like that because I can apply that to Alzheimer's. I'm all in as it relates to developing a cure, but I think more importantly, let's keep people from falling into the river in the first place. You know, we see headlines these days about these sudden breakthroughs in Alzheimer's treatment, and to be fair, they're pretty meaningless, and they are associated with significant downsides in terms of side effects, like brain shrinkage and brain hemorrhaging, etc. And the reality is they don't really slow the progression of this devastating illness to any significant degree. So again, should there be the development of a cure or a way of stabilizing Alzheimer's, I'm all in. I think it'd be terrific. But meanwhile, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, what's going on in the brains of Alzheimer's patients? And more importantly, then, once we understand that, what can we do to reverse that process, or at least face it head on and keep this problem from manifesting in the first place? And the good news is for your viewers that we know that information right now today. We have that information in our hands, and the real mission is to get that out to people so that they can change their lifestyle, they can make changes and create a way that they can actually be the arbiters of their brain's destiny.
What do we know about the diet and lifestyle practices that fuel dementia and that help to prevent it?
We recognize that Alzheimer's is primarily a metabolic condition, in this case, obviously, of the brain. To be fair, metabolism is a body-wide issue. What is affecting the metabolism in the liver, the pancreas, the heart, is also going to affect the brain. And it's really important to understand that this metabolic derangement that characterizes Alzheimer's disease is upstream, meaning it comes before this accumulation of this toxic protein that is the subject of so much research and development as it relates to drugs. Targeting the beta amyloid is interesting, but it's not the primary problem in Alzheimer's. As mentioned, Alzheimer's is a problem with metabolism, meaning how the brain cells utilize fuel to create energy and how they utilize fuel to basically operate. The brain is a very energy demanding organ. At rest, the brain, although weighing only 5% of our total body weight, is consuming about 25% of our total energy expenditure. So it's really hungry for energy. And when problems with metabolism begin to occur in the body, the brain is often early to suffer. And when it suffers, it means that the brain is now less able to utilize its fuel, primarily glucose, a sugar, to do the things that the brain must do so that we can function in a cognitive way, so that the various metrics of our cognitive function are preserved and do not decline with time, which is certainly the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So we have to take a step back and say, yeah, we know that in some patients, but certainly not all, there is this accumulation of beta amyloid, but it turns out that the metabolic issues and the inflammation in the brain that accompanies these metabolic changes are what instigates the formation of this beta amyloid. So in a very real sense, we're targeting a downstream consequence of this metabolic derangement. So when we talk about metabolism then, we talk about fuel utilization, and where do we get our fuel? We get it from the foods that we choose to consume. And as mentioned, the brain is primarily powered by glucose. We know that the brain can utilize as an alternative fuel fat, specifically a type of fat called ketones, but the brain requires the functionality of a hormone in the body called insulin. Insulin is what allows various parts of the brain to more appropriately use glucose as a fuel and therefore carry out the functions day to day and allow survivability and longevity of brain neurons. When that's compromised, when the function of insulin is compromised, it reduces the ability of brain neurons to work effectively. Ultimately, they degenerate, their mitochondria, their energy providing organelles begin to fail, and neurons begin to drop out in some very important areas of the brain, like the memory center, the hippocampus. So again, the foods that we choose to eat are playing the front and center role here, because the foods that we choose to eat, as well as other lifestyle factors that we'll talk about, are very, very fundamental to determine how that insulin works, how that insulin is able to nurture the brain and allow it to get fuel. And really, beyond that, insulin does other things in the brain, like nurtures brain cells, even beyond its role in allowing brain cells to have fuel. And this relates to the type of foods that we eat. Now, we recognize that when we eat foods that are high in sugar or highly processed carbohydrates, it causes insulin to be spiked, to increase quite dramatically. The problem with that is, in the long run, the body's cells, primarily the muscle cells and the liver cells, become less responsive to these higher and higher levels of insulin. We develop a situation that's called insulin resistance, meaning that our cells become less able to respond to this insulin over time. And the brain does not like that. The Alzheimer's brain is a brain that is starved of energy, if you will. This is called the bioenergetic theory of Alzheimer's. And what's really important, I think, for all of your viewers to get their arms around is that this process can occur 20 or 30 years ahead of time in terms of predicting who's going to have cognitive issues. In other words, 20 to 30 years before people begin to lose their memory and other markers of cognitive function, that's when we can demonstrate that the brain is having its bioenergetic issues, its problems in utilizing fuel, utilizing glucose as a fuel source, primarily as a consequence of this insulin receptivity failure that is brought on by our food choices.
What about fasting and intermittent fasting? We know that for our ancestors, many of them, not by choice, not because it was a health fad, but by necessity, many of them had periods of time when they didn't eat. And there may actually be some ways that our bodies were designed for some variance, not consuming a steady, consistent drip of calories all the time. Do you think that timed eating or periods of fast of some sort seem to be beneficial for the human body?
So much of my messaging these days really centers upon reestablishing a good relationship between evolution and environment, meaning our genes and the choices that we make, the environment in which we live. Because understand that for hundreds of thousands of years, our genome, the DNA that we all carry around, has been highly refined to allow us to survive and be healthy given a certain set of circumstances, meaning the type of environment in which our ancestors lived. But these days, we've turned the tables on that relationship. We're living in a time of evolutionary environmental mismatch such that we are confronting our physiology, which is the manifestation of our DNA, with influences for which it is ill-adapted. Our DNA doesn't code for our physiology to be able to respond appropriately to the type of diet that we are consuming. High in refined carbohydrates, ultra-processed foods, devoid to a certain degree in important things for our bodies like dietary fiber. Not to mention, of course now I'll mention, I love people say not to mention, then we have to mention what we are told not to mention. But things like inadequate amounts of restorative sleep, sedentarity, meaning spending too much time sitting down, not spending enough time in nature, not socializing, all of these things characterize the experiences, the day-to-day experiences of our ancestors, in addition to the fact that our ancestors lived in times of feast and famine, meaning there were times when food that could be hunted or gathered was plentiful, and other times when, in fact, we did not have access to readily available calories. And our genome modified itself or was selected for in such a way that it could allow us to survive those times when we didn't have enough to eat. We didn't have a caloric resource. And I think it's important that we emulate that, hence the importance of fasting, of depriving our bodies of food from time to time for periods of time, which we can discuss. But that is, that emulates what our ancestors experience. And not only is it something we can survive, but it turns out that our genome allows us to actually improve various markers of our physiology and our biochemistry when we've suddenly challenged our body with a stress, being caloric deprivation. So when we experience an actual good thing, when we challenge our bodies with a bad thing or stress, we call that hormesis. So this calorie exclusion, or at least restriction, for periods of time, is a hormetic event that has some upsides. We improve our sensitivity to insulin. We ultimately improve a variety of metabolic parameters. We induce the ability in the body to get rid of certain parts of cells that are defective. We call this autophagy. We help our bodies rid itself of things that are defective as it relates to mitochondria. We call that mitophagy, getting rid of defective mitochondria, which is really very, very important. The amount of time that we need to fast in order to activate autophagy and mitophagy, I think, is still up for debate, has not been fully clarified, at least for me to appreciate. But that said, even periodic fasting that can occur even on a daily basis, I think, is a good thing. And what does that mean, fasting on a daily basis? And it means what has become known as this episodic fasting, or more colloquially, time-restricted eating. Now, that's a bit of a nebulous term because it can mean condensing your eating window each day to 12 hours, 10 hours, or 8 hours. So we can't really say, well, let's compare the effectiveness of time-restricted eating to something else, a medication, a nutritional supplement, etc. Because, well, what do you mean when you use that term, time-restricted eating? Generally and globally, it means condensing the window in which you eat to a finite number of hours, as opposed to eating and snacking throughout the course of the day. A person might choose to begin that window during which time he or she eats at, let's say, 10 o'clock in the morning, and that would finish then at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Then that individual has from 6 p.m. until 10 a.m. the following day, during which nothing is consumed with the exception of water. So that induces in the body a period of time when there's no eating going on. It's well beyond just calorie restriction. It's actually, complete cessation of any nutrient whatsoever, and that has some upside. So am I a fan? You bet I am. Do I practice it? You bet I do. Do I need to practice it? I absolutely do at my age. And I'm well aware of how it affects me. I know how it affects my blood sugar moment to moment by virtue of the fact that I wear a continuous glucose monitor. I know how it affects my sleep. I know how it affects my athletic performance. I'm an N of 1. But the data in large data sets is certainly there. And we're even, interestingly, seeing mainstream literature come out in very mainstream medical journals comparing the effectiveness of, for example, time-restricted eating to even pharmaceutical intervention as it relates to things like various metabolic markers.
One thing I just want to appreciate about what you just said is you, of course, are studying the research and the data and applying appropriate thoughtfulness and skepticism to what we do and don't know. And you're also looking, as you just mentioned, at your own lived experience with the continuous glucose monitor, with tracking your sleep, with tracking your exercise performance. And I think for everybody watching, there's a lot to learn from that. Here's a researcher who knows so much about what the studies say, but he's also looking at his own life experience and how it is in his own body, because you're the only you on the planet, right?
Some people would say gratefully.
Right. We're each our own case study, if you will. And so learning and being curious is so powerful. And I just want to appreciate your curiosity as one of the many things that I so appreciate about you.
I think that it's so valuable to have that data. People go, I'm trying to find my phone because, I can check my blood sugar without having to do a finger stick at any given moment. I just finished lunch. My blood sugar right now is 110. And I can tell you that I'm looking at it right now because I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor. Now contrast that to what some people do, which is to visit the doctor once a year and have a fasting blood sugar. The comparison, I think, is dramatic. On the one hand, you're looking at a snapshot over a 1 year period at what the blood sugar was at that given moment, versus a very dynamic interaction that I'm experiencing, or anyone else is experiencing who wears a CGM, who can then learn what is the effect of my last meal, what happened last night if I didn't get a good night's sleep on my blood sugar, and therefore I should be more careful about staying up and watching Ted Lasso or whatever it may be. Making these changes, because controlling your blood sugar is paramount. Back to what's my interest, of course, brain functionality and moment to moment and resistance to developing Alzheimer's disease. That's my specialty, but it's also a personal issue. Having lost my father to Alzheimer's, believe me, I get it on multiple levels. I understand it on multiple levels. So my mission and the time we're spending together right now, which I value, always value, is to get these ideas out to people to make changes before they've begun the process of losing, obviously, cognitive function. Even before a person tests out as having a decay in their cognitive function, we call that mild cognitive impairment, there is something called subjective cognitive impairment, where you still might test out normal, but you know what? You're starting to realize that things aren't where they need to be cognitively. You're starting to forget grandchildren's names or Wi-Fi codes or whatever it may be, and maybe those are things that are important to you or not, but the point is you used to remember those things and now you don't. That is important because, as I mentioned earlier, the changes that begin in the brain, the metabolic changes that are the harbinger for then the clinical changes where we don't have good memory, these changes happen decades before the clinical manifestations or even the subjective manifestations where we begin to notice that we're losing cognitive function. So the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining, so said John F. Kennedy. And that's why I want to know my blood sugar right now. That's why I want to know how well I'm sleeping, because the quality and quantity of your sleep is a huge metabolic lever. If you don't sleep well, if you don't have enough restorative sleep, then your metabolism will be wonky the very next day. And guess what? Your blood sugar is going to go up, and you're paving the way for insulin resistance, and that is going to open the door to increasing your risk for Alzheimer's disease, which is by and large not a genetic situation. You know, there is something called carrying the APOE4 gene allele. People who do carry that gene allele have an increased risk. It's a predisposition, not a determinant. Means, you know, probably about 28% of people watching our time together right now have one or both APOE4 gene alleles, which increases risk. But by all means, be aware of the data that shows you can dramatically offset that risk by bringing your metabolism back into the game and gaining and engaging yourself in physical exercise. One study I reviewed this morning looked at the risk for Alzheimer's in people based upon the amount of exercise they get. And sure enough, they found that it's linear. The more exercise you get, the lower is your risk for Alzheimer's, even in people carrying the APOE4 allele. So, you know, people have this idea that, oh, mom and dad, or mom or dad had Alzheimer's, I'm destined. That's, I guess, the way it goes. I'll hope there's a medication. To me, I don't mean to be critical, but I believe that's wrong thinking, because we can make lifestyle choices right now that can absolutely offset this genetic risk. You know, every year we have Alzheimer's Awareness Week. Alzheimer's Awareness Week. And I don't know if there's anybody who's not aware already of Alzheimer's disease, right? Everybody is aware of it. Almost everybody is touched by it in some way. So we don't need to be just aware of Alzheimer's. We need to be aware of the fact that we can prevent it. So I'm actually involved right now in working with a team to create by next year Alzheimer's Prevention Week, where we're going to go toe-to-toe with this notion of awareness. You know, it's great to be aware of something, but let's do something about it. Again, I'll say this again. If there is a pharmaceutical fix, I'm all in. But meanwhile, while there isn't, we know that our food, for example, is so important in determining who does or who doesn't get this disease. So am I standing on the mountaintop kind of screaming this message out? You bet I am. And I'm going to continue to do that.
David, the 4 pillars of lifestyle medicine are sometimes summarized as eat better, stress less, love more, and move more. So far, we've talked a bit about eating better. We've talked a bit about moving more. We've even talked a bit about sleeping. We haven't talked so much about stressing less. And I particularly want to ask you about mindfulness, breathing practices, meditation. What do we know? What does the research say about the role of some of these things in physiological and mental health?
Well, we've seen data over at least the past decade that that mindfulness practices, and there's particular types of breathing practices, for example, when people engage in these things over a long period of time, we see preservation of the areas of the brain that are typically at risk for Alzheimer's disease. So this is, I guess as you describe it, this is a 4-legged stool. And so I think that's a really important thing to be considered, because, in the context of the fact that there's no pharmaceutical fix, why would we not want to bring on these lifestyle practices? The problem is that I think the messaging that people get is live your life however you want, and we're going to develop something one of these days to help you if you are diagnosed with Alzheimer's. engage in a mindfulness practice, eat the right foods, move more, and we should probably spend more time dealing with that, talking about that, and certainly sleep. These are important fundamental issues to dramatically reduce your risk for developing this situation, now ranked as the third leading cause of death in America. Think about that. And it doesn't have to happen to anyone watching us right now. We can offset that risk dramatically by engaging in these lifestyle practices. And the bottom line is, they're free. That's what is so breathtaking. And it is precisely because they are free that they are non-remunerative and we don't hear about them. Taking the newest, latest beta amyloid targeting drug is anything but free, costing tens of thousands of dollars annually, barely able to move the needle in terms of preservation of cognitive function, and replete with variety of dangerous side effects. And yet the things we're talking about, dietary changes, paying attention to your sleep, involve yourself in a meditative practice, and moving are so fundamentally important and are just available for the picking. Now, I mentioned a continuous glucose monitor. That's not necessarily free, but for anyone who has prediabetes or diabetes, a physician can authorize that, and it's the type of thing that insurance can cover. I'm not diabetic or pre-diabetic, so I don't get a free pass on this one. In general, if I were to go to the pharmacy. But that said, there are ways. And, by all means, even if you don't know your blood sugar, it's time to incorporate into your lifestyle choices those dietary and other lifestyle recommendations that are going to help you control your blood sugar. And it might seem that I'm fixated on this notion of controlling your blood sugar, and I am. I absolutely am, because that's where the rubber meets the road as it relates to the brain.
You're a neurologist who's chosen to focus a lot on the microbiome. Tell us a bit about what made that a focal point of your research.
Well, for me, nothing's off the table. And getting involved in understanding the gut as it related to the brain really, I think, distanced me even further from my mainstream colleagues back in the day. Because, in neurology school, we learned that there's the brain and then there's the rest of the body. The brain is, let's say, in Chicago, and the liver lives in Los Angeles, etc. That there's this compartmentalization of organs and organ systems, and never shall they interact. Well, medicine has never been practiced that way prior to Western medicine. This compartmentalization of the various systems is just a bit of a perversion in terms of historically, and even in terms of how the body is looked upon in many other places in the world, even today. So I'm not going to say that I chose to focus on the gut because it was seemingly the furthest away from the brain, but I did choose to focus on the brain, on the gut, via the conduit of nutrition, recognizing that for years we've known that certain nutritional practices tend to favor health. The question arose in my mind as to why. Well, why is it good to have certain things in the diet, or why is it bad to have certain things in the diet, like, having a lot of sugar, having a lot of processed foods? What are they doing? We all know that having these ultra-processed foods in the diet is bad for health, bad for physiology, bad for metabolism, and ultimately bad for the brain. But why? And there are multiple avenues one can explore, but for me, I began to wonder, well, what is the effect of these types of foods on the gut bacteria? Because we know that the gut bacteria are, in fact, intimately involved in being in how the brain works, in the brain's ability to resist damage, to resist decline, how the gut bacteria are involved in regulating metabolism is important, how they're involved in the set point of inflammation, a cardinal mechanism related to brain degeneration. And as I began exploring that, I found not only was it really interesting from multiple perspectives, not the least of which was the fact that I didn't know much about it, and I always find those areas to be really intriguing, but it also opened the door to be able to do things for individuals to help them preserve their brains. My gosh, to think that the trillions of various organisms living in the gut, and that may seem like a large number because that exceeds the number of bacteria in the gut. And I say trillions because we now recognize that it's not just the gut bacteria, but there are 10 times as many viruses living in the gut, and there are fungi as well. And the interesting thing about these the viruses living within the gut is that many of them are involved in regulating bacterial metabolism, bacterial activity. Yes, over the years, as we have talked before, we focused on the gut bacteria. We've looked at things like dietary fiber to nurture the gut bacteria. We've looked at prebiotics in terms of how they nurture gut bacteria. We've looked at probiotics. We've looked at the types of bacteria that are found in fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkraut, etc. We've looked at the prebiotic-rich foods like jicama, for example, and talked about how they play a role in gut health and therefore body health and certainly brain health. But now we recognize that viruses have gotten such a bad name as of late because of, well, for various pandemic type reasons. But once again, we talked about bacteria in the past as being germs, and we were germophobic and washing our hands because, gosh, we wouldn't want to be exposed to somebody else's bacteria. But the lion's share of bacteria living within our guts are there to help us. They share the table with us. They eat with us. They are commensal. That's what that word means, commensal bacteria. They eat what you eat. They eat what anyone eats, and therefore that gives a lot of importance to the foods that we choose, because it's not just that we like them. We should be thinking that we are trying to nurture those organisms that live upon us and within us so that they can go about their job, one of which is to keep us healthy. They're involved in our metabolism. They're involved in our gene expression. Think about that the bacteria living within the gut to some degree regulate the expression of our life code, our DNA. And so it really raises the level of importance of our dietary and other lifestyle choices as it relates to looking at our bacteria through the lens of our own selfishness, our own health. And therefore, this became a very, very intriguing and attractive area for me to pursue because it opened the door to an awful lot of new things that I could be doing and recommending, and it gave a lot of traction to my dietary recommendations that I was making to patients and in my book writing outreach and lecturing outreach, as well as, let's not underestimate, the effects of others of our lifestyle choices as they relate to the health and functionality of the gut bacteria. Yes, we focus on foods. I'd say that's the biggest input. But our physical exercise, the amount of restorative sleep that we get, the amount of stress that we experience, have all inputs into our microbiome, the health and functionality of our microbiome. We know, for example, that when we are stressed, our bodies secrete higher levels of a hormone called cortisol, and this cortisol prepares us for the stress that we are experiencing. However, cortisol has by and large, a pretty detrimental effect upon things going on in the gut, favoring the survivability and functionality of organisms that may not be in our interest in the long run, and also increasing the leakiness or permeability of the gut wall, and therefore ultimately leading to inflammation, which can threaten the body and certainly threaten the brain.
Let's go a little deeper on fiber. What is the significance of fiber to microbial health in our bodies? And are there particular kinds of fiber that are beneficial? Are there any kinds of fiber that you think are maybe even not beneficial?
True that we need dietary fiber. And I would say that if that could be considered another food group, or at least a macronutrient, I'd be all in. Along with fat, carbohydrates, and protein, I'd love to say dietary fiber because it would raise it to a level of importance where it needs to be. But dietary fiber is by definition carbohydrate, and as such we can characterize it in that group. But it's fundamental, and it's progressively declining in the Western diet. And that's very, very threatening because it's critical for gut health and for the health and functionality of the various types of bacteria that reside within us, upon whose health and functionality we depend in order to stay healthy from multiple perspectives, including metabolic health, including things like obesity and diabetes, but certainly as it relates to the brain as well. So that's why we need much higher levels of dietary fiber. It's been estimated that our hunter-gatherer forebears may have consumed as much as 100 grams of dietary fiber on a daily basis. We now, hope that people might get 20 grams of fiber in their diet. So we've got to do our very best through our choices to increase the consumption of dietary fiber. Primarily, dietary fiber comes from fruits and vegetables. When I say primarily, I should have used the word exclusively. There is no dietary fiber in any animal-based product whatsoever. We don't consume meat, fish, chicken, milk, dairy products with the hope of getting dietary fiber. It doesn't exist in animal products. It's the reason that, over the years, yours truly have continued to increase my messaging as it relates to choosing a more plant-based diet. I am not a vegetarian or vegan. I do consume some animal products, that's for sure, like wild salmon. And I know it's wild because I catch it myself, and we freeze it and bring it home and generally have enough in our hunting and gathering, in this case hunting, to last us for several months. But again, over the years, I have increased the percentage of my calorie that is plant-based, really for a number of reasons. But as we're having this discussion on dietary fiber, it's really on the very top of the list in terms of dietary considerations. When we process out the dietary fiber in these ultra-processed foods, it is yet another threat to our health, along with raising our blood sugar and challenging insulin functionality. It's the lack of dietary fiber in these foods that is yet another factor that's so threatening to our health.
Do you consider any particular types of dietary fiber, such as soluble fibers, to be especially beneficial? And can you tell us the foods that are highest in them?
I think eating an adequate amount of fruits and vegetables is going to give you the right type of fiber. I think that when people talk about soluble versus insoluble fiber, it's more along the lines of what goes on in the world of supplementing, using a supplement for a fiber. So I think eating a variety of colorful fruits and vegetables will give you both. I think some dietary fiber is characterized as being prebiotic, and there are various forms of that. And there are various foods that are higher in the prebiotic fiber, i.e. the type of fiber that nurtures the gut bacteria more so. So I'm not thinking that it's really that critical to delineate between soluble and insoluble. Eating lots of cruciferous vegetables, for example, I think gives you some wonderful fiber as it relates to nurturing the gut bacteria, as well as the other good things that are going to come that are found in these types of vegetables that are good for you, and even sprouts of these vegetables as well. So I think just emphasizing fiber-rich fruits and vegetables is going to be important.
Do you have any thoughts on xylitol, erythritol, stevia, monk fruit, other versions of the low or no calorie sweeteners that are often marketed as being healthier than, say, aspartame or sucralose?
We're seeing, such an emphasis these days on so-called artificial sweeteners, some of which are actually natural sweeteners as well. And I'd say that by and large, when we look at things like aspartame, what's so concerning is the effects of aspartame on the gut bacteria and the relationship between aspartame consumption and metabolic derangement, if you will, increased risk of, for example, type 2 diabetes and weight gain. So I'm not a huge proponent of really any of these. We know that xylitol, which is a sugar alcohol, is now known to raise uric acid, and uric acid elevation is certainly a metabolic threat. We know that erythritol has recently been found to have some significant health risks associated with it, and as such, I believe should be avoided. Having said that, there is some bright news on the horizon, actually not even on the horizon, something that we are looking at now, and that is something called allulose. And allulose turns out to be a sweetener that actually has positive metabolic effects, actually is associated with better control of blood sugar, improved insulin sensitivity. We know that allulose is a type of sweetener that tastes very much like sugar, table sugar, although it is only 70% as sweet, so you have to use a little bit more. But it actually has some properties that are similar to what we call the GLP-1 agonists. And what do I mean by that? GLP-1 agonists are medications, if you will, pharmaceuticals that are all the rage these days. Things like Wegovy and Ozempic act to stimulate the GLP-1 receptor, so they're called GLP-1 agonists. Turns out that allulose, this sweetener, has some GLP-1 activity, and that's pretty exciting to think about that, because that may certainly have some play as it relates to metabolism, certainly as it relates to the brain. So I'm actually using allulose sweetener these days. I've always enjoyed having my coffee sweetened, but gave up on it for years and years in an attempt to keep my blood sugar under control. Now I'm getting to sweeten my coffee a little bit because I'm back to using allulose. So there you go.
So are you saying that allulose, I mean, at very crude level, does it decrease appetite for some people? Would that be a concern for someone who is underweight?
Well, it actually decreases appetite and actually is associated with early satiety, meaning that it, because of its effect on slowing gastric emptying, it actually allows you to feel full at an earlier stage. How might that be? How might that affect somebody who's underweight? I'd say it's a good consideration. I haven't really thought that through. Basically because these days finding people who are underweight takes quite a bit of effort in our modern society. That said, I think for most people, and I think I'm on fair ground here, solid ground in saying most people looking around at our society who are either overweight or clinically obese, would benefit, therefore, from an intervention that would help them reduce weight, that would lead to early satiety, and help them reduce their overall consumption of calories.
What about probiotics, David? Do you think they have a place for some people? And if so, what should folks bear in mind about that?
There's no question that probiotics have utility as demonstrated on clinical interventional trials. There is clear evidence that probiotics can reduce markers of inflammation. They can reduce gut permeability, which is a big issue as it relates to inflammation in the human body. So I think we are watching the emergence of more and more research these days dealing with interventional trials, looking at specific strains of probiotics. And now, exciting to see that we're actually seeing research looking at what are called bacteriophages. Those are the viruses in the gut that are able to modulate the action, the metabolism of gut bacteria. Viruses controlling bacteria. So now research looking at interventions using the viruses to control the gut bacteria to see if that helps. We see rodent research already showing improvements in brain function with interventions based upon manipulating the gut virome, not necessarily directly involved in changing the gut bacteria, but changing the way the bacteria work based on upstream control that is leveraged by viruses. So it's an exciting time, that's for sure. And this is not necessarily new technology. These bacteriophages have been employed by industry to control, for example, bacterial overgrowth in production plants of food products, for example. That's been around for a couple of decades.
If somebody is thinking about taking a probiotic supplement, some may worry about over-colonizing with, one specific strain and throwing off the diversity of their microbiome. Are there any suggestions you have for how to address those potential risks and what an appropriate amount is and what to look for? Or is it so varied based on an individual experience that it's really hard to give universal recommendations?
Well, I think I can give some pretty broad encompassing recommendations. And that is, first, understand that when you take a probiotic that has a lot of different bacteria types in it, and I vote for at least 12, 13, 14, a large array of different bacteria, because it will then cover where a deficiency might be with tens of billions of available bacteria, or what we call colony-forming units. I think it's a good broad recommendation based upon the research. But understand that when you take these bacteria, they are affecting the functionality of the resident bacteria that are there already. That's primarily how they work. That if you use a probiotic that had a labeled organism or a unique organism in it, that it's very, very unlikely that there will be any recoverability of that particular organism when the stool is analyzed in a research setting. Meaning that you could take probiotics, but the idea that you're going to then increase the levels of that particular strain of bacteria in the gut probably isn't what's happening. What is happening is you're affecting the resident bacteria in terms of their functionality, and as such, that's where the benefits are derived from. It's how the bacteria in the probiotic are affecting the functionality of the resident bacteria. So I think that that's a concept that takes a little work in terms of getting your arms around, but it does tend to validate when we see clinical studies showing effectiveness of probiotic intervention in one clinical trial or another, tends to validate that there is indeed a mechanism whereby it's working even though these bacteria aren't recovered in the stool. The original finding that these bacteria were not recovered in the stool made drew the conclusion that, well, gosh, they don't even show up in the stool. They're probably getting killed off right away. Maybe they're not. Obviously they're not, because they are having a clinical benefit. And it turns out that you may not necessarily need viable organisms to affect a change in terms of clinically when you take a probiotic. And that kind of challenges people as well, because you see the probiotics in the refrigerator and they're ostensibly there to keep the bacteria alive. Turns out that even the coatings over the bacteria have activity that affects the other bacteria in the gut when these probiotics are taken, such that we're now seeing probiotics that contain, not to be too technical, but when you make a probiotic, you take a bunch of bacteria and you ferment them. And then you dry what's left and you put them in a pill, and that's called probiotic. But when they are fermenting, the liquid in which they ferment is called the supernatant when it is removed. Turns out that supernatant, now not the bacteria themselves, but the stuff in which they were fermenting, has some really strong activity as well in terms of being favorable clinically. So now we're actually seeing probiotics made with dried supernatant, and they're even more effective. I think that what I'm saying in a general way is that as the years go by, the production of probiotics is getting better and better as we begin to understand more and more of these nuances that, hey, the bacteria don't even necessarily need to be alive. All this care that's been taken to keep them alive, there is evidence that even not alive, they're still having biological activity.
What about fermented foods?
I think fermented foods are a plus. I certainly include kimchi, other fermented foods in my diet. I think this is a really wonderful, natural way to emulate what our ancestors did. Now, our ancestors didn't have refrigeration and pretty much ate what they could find on the ground, or maybe if they were lucky once in a while they'd kill an animal, they would eat that too. But pretty much our diet ancestrally was based upon what we would find on the ground. And let's be clear, oftentimes what you find on the ground is rotting fruits and vegetables. And when you're feast and famine, when you are at risk for dying of starvation, you're going to eat stuff that's already started to rot. And what is rotting? Well, rotting is fermentation. When a food begins to rot, bacteria in that food are digesting it and replicating and fermenting. That's what that process is. And as such, fermented foods have always been a part of the human experience, at least as it relates to our ancestors. And it was and is a way that we continue to colonize our gut with those bacteria. So I'm very much in favor of the idea of fermenting food, as well as buying foods that are fermented, things like kimchi and sauerkraut, etc., and consuming them. I think that's a real handy way of further inoculating the gut with good bacteria.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about your rather provocatively titled book, Drop Acid. Obviously, you're not referring to the chemical LSD here, but you are referring to uric acid and its impact on the human body. And this is not something most people know very much about. So why did you write a book about it?
Well, first, let me talk about the title. And not an interview goes by that I don't smile, because I think back about that, how we chose that title. I don't know how I stumbled upon it, but I will say that our publisher at first didn't necessarily embrace it. And I said, just be with it for a little while, pass it around the office, see what people think. And ultimately they thought it was edgy, because the subtitle, I think, makes it clear that we're talking about uric acid. We're not talking about, as you mentioned, hallucinogens. And the genesis of my interest in uric acid began actually running one day. When I run, a lot of times I'll either listen to music or a podcast here or there. And I was listening to a podcast one day of an interview of a researcher and clinician by the name of Dr. Richard Johnson at the University of Colorado, who just captivated me, because he was talking about, he's a nephrologist, a kidney specialist, and as such has a bit more experience with uric acid than perhaps an internist would because of kidney stones and etc. But that said, he also explored uric acid from the perspective of metabolism, and that was a revelation for me. What could uric acid have to do with metabolism? I mean, after all, when we in medical school studied uric acid on that one afternoon, it was uric acid causes gout, here's the medicine to bring it down, end of story. And here Dr. Johnson is talking about how our ancestors 8 million years ago faced starvation, and those of our primate ancestors who happened to have a higher uric acid ended up surviving. And they had a higher uric acid because of a series of genetic mutations that got rid of an enzyme that would have broken down their uric acid. Uricase is the enzyme. And because of their higher uric acid, they survived. Why? Because higher uric acid allowed them to store just a little bit more body fat, raise their blood pressure as a hedge against dehydration, raise their blood sugar so they could power their brains to avoid starvation and predation, so they didn't starve and they didn't become somebody else's meal. And we humans today have inherited that loss of that enzyme, and therefore our uric acid levels remain elevated. Again, it served as a powerful survival mechanism for us, but these days, in the time of food abundance, this higher level of uric acid doing what it does, which is codes for, in the presence of higher levels of food, specifically things like fructose, fruit sugar, makes us fatter, increases our insulin resistance, damages our mitochondrial function, and raises our blood pressure. These are not favorable things that high levels of uric acid does to us. And, for me as a neurologist, those are all issues that relate to brain health or threaten the brain, as it were, depending on your perspective. So when I heard this, at the end of my run, I got to the mailbox and I said, I got to go again. And I doubled my run that day so I could listen to this podcast interview with Dr. Johnson yet again. And I stopped and I said to myself, if you want to understand something, read a book about it. If you want to master something, write the book about it. And I said, at that moment, I've got to write a book about uric acid, because this is so compelling and powerful and can be leveraged for better health that the world needs to know about it. And therefore, that's what was the genesis of writing this book that came to be known as Drop Acid, now translated into many languages around the world, became a New York Times bestseller, hopefully because of the importance of its message, because this is yet another powerful tool for us to rein in metabolic dysfunction and become healthier because our metabolism is better. And yes, it absolutely relates to brain health as well. All coming down to metabolism, how our insulin works, how is our blood sugar. Turns out that uric acid plays a central role in that. And, you know, to think that for all of these decades, I, like most physicians, had really looked at uric acid in the context of gout, it is so much more.
Thank you, David. You know, you spoke earlier about how you wanted to shout your message from the rooftops. If you were shouting from the rooftops, maybe not shouting, but speaking, lovingly and presently and kindly, yeah, what would you say?
I'd say, very simply, become empowered right now, and that empowerment is through knowledge, to make changes, to be the architect of your health destiny. Again, we're convinced that we should live our lives however we want, and that modern medical science is going to be there to bail us out. That's not reality. The reality is that we need to make decisions now and become empowered by the knowledge in terms of what those decisions are to chart a better health destiny for us. Because, you know, by and large, the average that we see, what's going on in Western nations and certainly in America, is a decline in life expectancy, in multiple health parameters, and it doesn't have to be that way. We can choose to live a long and healthy life, not just a longer lifespan, but a longer health span as well, and remain cognitively intact as we reach our older years. And that's the message that each and every one of the viewers of our time together today should feel empowered that she or he can make changes right now to chart a better health destiny.
Beautiful. Thank you, David. We've been talking here today with Dr. David Perlmutter, a board-certified neurologist and a 6 times New York Times best-selling author of many books, including his latest, Drop Acid, The Surprising New Science of Uric Acid, the Key to Losing Weight, Controlling Blood Sugar, and Achieving Extraordinary Health. David, thank you so much for your decades of leading-edge research, for your many, many books, for your wisdom, and for your partnership in the food revolution.
For having me, and I just I feel very grateful that we work together on these types of projects, and that I'm grateful that you are out there getting this critically important information out to as many people as will listen. So that's really why I say thank you.
Thank you.